The day the earth trembled, the ground didn't just shake. It roared. One moment, the city was alive with the hum of daily life. The next, it was as if the earth itself had come alive, determined to remind everyone of its power. It was 1985 in Mexico City, and the people had no idea what was coming. At 7:19 a.m., an earthquake, with a magnitude of 8.1, tore through the heart of the capital, leaving behind devastation that would forever change the city's skyline, its people, and the course of its history. Hashtag the calm before the storm. Mexico City, with its population of nearly 20 million, was a vibrant, chaotic city that had grown rapidly since the 1950s. It was a city of contrasts. Sleek modern office buildings stood side by side with historic colonial-era structures, and luxury hotels lined streets that also housed open-air markets filled with the hum of daily life. It was a city proud of its heritage, but also one in the throes of rapid modernization. At 7 a.m., the streets were already crowded with commuters. Luis, a young architect, was seated at his desk in the office of a construction firm, sipping coffee as he reviewed the plans for a new building. The radio in the background played a popular song from the Mexican band Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, a tune that would soon be forever tied to the morning of September 19, 1985. Across town, 32-year-old Claudia was just finishing breakfast in her small apartment. She was a nurse, fresh off a night shift at the local hospital, when she felt the first tremor. It wasn't much, just a brief shiver, almost like a passing truck. But as the minutes passed, the city seemed to take on a strange tension, as if something invisible was pressing down on the air itself. Her mother had warned her about earthquakes, about how the old buildings in Mexico City were fragile, but it was always just a distant fear. Until now. At 7:19 a.m., the world changed. Hashtag the first shock. The shaking began suddenly, and it was unlike anything Luis or Claudia had ever experienced. Luis felt the floor of his office ripple beneath him, as though the entire building had become a giant, swaying reed in a river. A loud, deep rumble echoed through the city. For a split second, there was confusion. Was this just a tremor? But then came the roar, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. A violent, terrible force lifted the city off its foundations. The ceiling tiles in Luis's office cracked and fell. Bookshelves toppled over, and glass windows shattered in a storm of sharp, glistening fragments. Desks were flung across the room. Luis ducked under his desk instinctively, heart pounding, as the world around him seemed to collapse. He heard the screams of co-workers and the ominous creaks of the building groaning under the strain. The earthquake, with a magnitude of 8.1 on the Richter scale, lasted for 2 full minutes. But in those minutes, the city was transformed from a bustling metropolis to a scene of utter chaos. Across the city, the devastation was even more severe. High-rise buildings, once symbols of Mexico City's economic growth, buckled and crumpled to the ground. The iconic Torre Latinoamericana, the city's tallest building at the time, swayed dangerously, and though it didn't collapse, many other buildings surrounding it did. Streets cracked open, swallowing cars. Bridges collapsed. Roads became impassable, and power lines snapped, sending electrical fires raging through the city. In Claudia's neighborhood, the ground trembled so violently that the walls of her apartment cracked. She grabbed her purse instinctively, then ran outside, where the streets were filled with people shouting, crying, or frozen in terror. The sky was filled with dust. In the distance, the ominous sound of crumbling buildings could be heard, like the city itself was giving up on its own foundations. Hashtag the chaos of the aftermath. In the immediate aftermath, Mexico City descended into confusion. Rescue teams were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the destruction. The city's communication systems were down. Phones, radios, and television broadcasts all went silent. No one knew the full extent of the damage. But the people of Mexico City, many of whom had never faced a disaster of this magnitude, didn't wait for help to arrive. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had never been trained in disaster response, became first responders. Luis, covered in dust and debris, stumbled out of his office building. He was shaken, his heart pounding, but he quickly realized that he couldn't just stand there. His training as an architect made him keenly aware of the danger of collapsed buildings. He rushed to the nearest wreckage, where several people were trapped beneath a pile of rubble. Using his knowledge of structural support, he directed a small group of people to move debris to free them. His hands bled, his legs trembled, but he didn't stop. Meanwhile, Claudia, who had been near the epicenter of the quake, rushed to the local hospital, where she was quickly swept into the chaos. The facility, itself a target for the quake, had been partially damaged, but it still had a functioning emergency room. Wounded people poured in, many with broken limbs, lacerations, and internal injuries. In a moment of pure instinct, Claudia found herself organizing the injured, triaging them, and helping with what little medical equipment was available. The streets of Mexico City became makeshift hospitals. People who had little more than bandages or the will to help offered aid. Human chains were formed to pass water, food, and medical supplies through the rubble. The spirit of cooperation, even in the face of overwhelming loss, was a testament to the strength of the city's people. Survival amid the ruins. The days following the earthquake were filled with uncertainty. There were no immediate estimates on how many people had perished or how many had been injured. Rescue workers, both from Mexico and international teams, worked tirelessly, but every hour was precious. Every survivor was a miracle. As the city's infrastructure collapsed, makeshift shelters were erected, and those who still had homes found themselves sharing them with neighbors whose houses had been destroyed. Claudia, despite her exhaustion, continued to work. Her hands were raw from digging through rubble, but her resolve never wavered. "We can save them," she would whisper to the volunteers around her, urging them on. Even when the aftershocks came, strong enough to rattle the foundations of newly formed shelters, Claudia stayed at the front lines, pushing herself to save lives. Luis, having escaped the worst of the damage to his building, helped organize teams of volunteers to clear roads. His expertise in construction proved invaluable. He worked side by side with other architects, engineers, and ordinary citizens who had no professional training, but who shared a common goal: to rebuild the city, piece by piece. Meanwhile, across the city, a nationwide relief effort began to take shape. The Mexican government, in coordination with local organizations, launched emergency operations, but the scale of the disaster was so large that outside help was crucial. International teams, including those from the United States, Japan, and other countries, arrived within hours, bringing search and rescue dogs, medical supplies, and heavy machinery. In the aftermath of the earthquake, more than 10,000 people were confirmed dead, and tens of thousands more were injured. But amidst the grief and the loss, there were also incredible stories of survival. People who had been trapped under collapsed buildings for days, emerging covered in dust but alive. Strangers who had become family, bound together by the shared trauma of the event. Hashtag a city reborn. The rebuilding process took years. Mexico City would never be the same, but it emerged from the rubble stronger and more united. The disaster led to significant changes in building codes, as architects and engineers worked to ensure that the city's infrastructure would be better prepared for future earthquakes. Many of the city's old, vulnerable buildings were replaced with newer, safer structures, but the heart of Mexico City, the resilient, fiery spirit of its people, remained. Luis and Claudia, like thousands of others, became symbols of Mexico City's strength. Luis would later go on to design buildings that withstood future earthquakes, while Claudia's experience in the aftermath of the disaster led her to become a leader in disaster preparedness and public health. The earthquake had torn the city apart, but it had also brought the people of Mexico City together in a way that nothing else could. It showed the world that even when the earth trembles beneath your feet, the human spirit remains unbroken. The day the earth trembled became, for many, a reminder of the indomitable strength of the people and the enduring hope that rises from the rub.